Hello，大家好，又係我高 B 哥啊，係時間提醒大家飲水啦，增添智慧，增添水分，智慧如水啊！好啦，高 B 哥一陣間咧放條影片俾大家睇，好長嘅條影片，但係咧好值得睇，因為咧米爾斯海默大家都知咧，佢係一個咧咬死自己嗰個修昔底德陷阱唔放嗰個嘅理論嘅一位專家。咁喺美國咧，其實咧好有影響力㗎嚇。咁啊，跟住咧，佢咧已經話咗咧，即係兩個大國咧，去到咧大家都咁高咁大嘅時候咧，無可避免咧一定要打仗。呢個就係佢嘅一個咧理論嚟㗎。OK，咁啊，經常性咧都不停咧揾一啲嘅理由啊，或者係論點論據咧嚟支持佢呢個講法。嗱，不過今次咧佢唔係講呢樣嘢，而係調翻轉咧就講咧美國啊點樣崛起。繼而咧，跟住咧就推行咧佢嗰個所謂叫做咧民主自由咁啊，但係咧有美國例外論，即係雙標呢一樣嘢啦。咁啊，跟住繼而咧就係預種咧，即係呢個中國同埋俄羅斯嘅崛起。咁啊，繼而最後咧就失敗。佢咧係一步一步咁樣咧解釋俾大家聽噶。咁啊，可能咧會長少少。但係咧，當大家聽完米爾斯海默講呢個説話咧，即係呢個論據咧，你就會明白晒。因為咧，我覺得今次講咧係其中一個真相嗱，唔係所有，係其中一個真相嚟噶。而且講得咧，即係幾直白，佢直接咧都話咗佢自己都唔中意美國咁樣做，但係咧的而且確佢就咁樣做咗嗱，因為佢講嘅嘢係歷史啊，已經做咗嘅嘢嚟。OK，咁所以咧佢咧一路嗰個講解，一步一步咁拆解俾大家聽啊。咁所以咧，大家咧俾心機咧聽晒佢，好嘛？聽晒之後咧，下邊咧留言，跟住咧可以分享出去，同埋咧大家喺度討論一下。咁啊，裏邊可能你有啲嘢咧未必完完整整同意晒佢講，不過咧佢係一個比較多理論啦，同埋咧即係睇啲嘢咧係比較真係現實一啲。佢自己都不停強調佢自己係一個現實主義者嚟㗎。咁佢話如果用現實主義去睇咧，呢啲嘢咧做錯晒嘅直情。咁啊，翻轉頭就係。你就算點搞政治都好，你唔能夠咧唔理現實噶嘛，係咪？好啦，咁而家去片先啊。
This with Donald Trump. Remember, Donald Trump ran in the campaign on a platform that he referred to as America First. Just think about that. America First. America, particular nation, take care of us first. And he has made it very clear that he does not want anybody interfering in our sovereignty. And he was saying yesterday he doesn't think we should be interfering in the sovereignty of other countries. Right? That's recognition of the power of nationalism. Right? So nations want their own state. And then once you get nation states, they place enormous importance on sovereignty or self-determination. Who are these Russians to be interfering in our elections? The United States is a sovereign country. No country like Russia, or any other country for that matter, has the right to interfere in our elections. It's the basic argument here. That's what nationalism is really all about. Okay, so you get a feel for the difference between liberalism and nationalism. Liberalism focuses on the individual, and therefore, because it emphasizes individual rights, which everybody has a universalistic dimension. Nationalism is particularistic at the core, right? Fundamentally different. Okay, so what's liberal hegemony? I've given you the definition of liberalism and the definition of nationalism that I've worked out. Let me talk a little bit about liberal hegemony. It's basically an attempt to remake the world in America's image. And it has three components. The first is spreading liberal democracy all over the globe. And the reason that I put 3 stars up there is it is the most important of the 3. This is the idea that we want to turn every country into a liberal democracy. We want every country on the planet to have the same political system that we do here in the United States. Second goal is we want to integrate more and more countries into the open international economy. This is where we have an emphasis on free trade, lots of economic intercourse, right? Free capital flows, and so forth and so on. You know the whole story. And then third is we want to integrate more and more countries into international institutions, like the World Trade Organization, the IMF, NATO, think NATO expansion, the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the Obama administration was building and which President Trump cashiered. Okay, the liberal story places a great emphasis on institutions. It places a great emphasis on an open international economy, and most importantly, on spreading democracy. Just to give you a feel for this, Donald Trump ran against liberal hegemony. Right. And liberal hegemony, to be clear, was supported by both Republicans and Democrats. As I like to say, the Republicans especially, but the Democrats also like to make the argument that there's a big difference between the two parties on foreign policy. This is not a serious argument. This is Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Hardly any difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. There's a real difference between Donald Trump and both of them. Remember, Donald Trump ran the table in the Republican primaries by criticizing the Republicans' performance on the foreign policy front for decades and criticizing the Democrats in the general election. Donald Trump said, I'm not interested in spreading liberal democracy across the globe. And in fact, he was quite comfortable making nice with dictators. Second, he was not interested in supporting an open international economy. In fact, he is showing today that he is willing to put tariffs on China, Canada, and our European allies. And as far as international institutions are concerned, he said NATO is obsolete. He was contemptuous of the World Trade Organization, contemptuous of the European Union, does not like the IMF, does not like the World Bank, does not like NAFTA, cashiered the TPP. That's Donald Trump. He ran against this. But Obama, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, they embraced this after the Cold War ended. And by the way, it was the failure of this policy. It's the failure of American policy that helped put Donald Trump in the White House. For those of you who say to yourself, how could this man have ever been elected President of the United States? I'm telling you an important part of the story. Right? It's the failure of the foreign policy elites in this country to produce the past 30 years. Okay. What are the benefits of liberal hegemony? This is very important. In other words, why did we go down this road? In part is due to the fact that the foreign policy elites in the United States had a story to tell about how this was going to lead to all sorts of wonderful consequences. First of all, if you turn every country on the planet into a liberal democracy, you basically eliminate significant human rights violations. We don't need R2P or any more of these policies that are designed to run around the world protecting human rights, because human rights are no longer threatened, because the world is comprised of nothing but liberal democracies. Second, and maybe even more importantly, liberals tend to believe, and again, I'm using liberals to include Democrats and Republicans, they believe in what's called democratic peace theory. That is that liberal democracies don't fight each other. So if you can create a world of nothing but liberal democracies, they don't fight each other, peace breaks out, and problems like proliferation and terrorism are taken off the table. And it's just a world of peace, love, and dope. Can't get much better than that, right? And then finally, it makes the world safe for liberal democracy. As you all know, inside every liberal democracy, there are going to be elements who don't like liberal democracy. When I was a kid, this was the Communist Party in the United States. Well, if there's no Soviet Union out there that's a communist state that can interact with those communists in the United States, then you don't have to worry about those communists in the United States getting support from abroad. So what we do is we make the whole planet nothing but liberal democracies, and that really ameliorates the problems that any of these liberal democracies have on the home front, because there's no foreign power that can assist them. This is a Woodrow Wilson-like argument made by the likes of George Bush, right? So these are the three great benefits of liberal hegemony. And this is what propelled people to pursue this policy of remaking the world in America's image, which mainly means spreading liberal democracy. Now, why did the US pursue liberal hegemony? First of all, as I said to you folks before, the United States is a profoundly liberal country. It's what makes the United States a wonderful place. You should understand here that I am not arguing that liberalism is a bad thing, period, end of story. I actually think that liberal democracy is the best political system you can possibly have. And I thank my lucky stars that I was born in the United States of America, a liberal democracy, and raised in a liberal democracy. I would want it no other way. My argument is that liberal democracy is the best of all possible political systems that you can have. But as a foreign policy, liberalism is bankrupt. Right? So you understand the argument I'm making here. But this is a fundamentally liberal country. And realists like me, John Schuessler, Jason Castillo, they can tell you this. Realists like me and them have a tough time in America because liberals don't like realists. Right? That's why so many people don't like me. Right? Because I'm a realist on foreign policy grounds. Right? So this is a profoundly liberal country. And just to go back to that slide, when you start trying to sell these kinds of arguments in the early 1990s, it's very easy to do. Americans just gravitate to these arguments because it is a liberal country. Second, American nationalism supplied an unhealthy dose of hubris to the equation. This is a very important part of the story. John told you that nationalism is the most powerful political ideology on the planet. What I'm telling you also, I didn't say this before, but I'll tell you now, the United States is a very nationalistic country. If you go to the library here, University of Chicago, Harvard, you name it, right? There are whole wings of the library that are filled with books about American liberalism. There is probably one shelf worth of books on American nationalism because we never talk about ourselves as a nationalistic country. We are very nationalistic. Let me just say a few words about this. Madeleine Albright, canonical liberal, right, loves liberal hegemony, is famous for saying this: America is the indispensable nation. We stand taller and we see further. This is pure, unadulterated nationalism. America as opposed to the other, right? That America is the indispensable, there's the word, nation. Nation as in nationalism. We are the indispensable nation. We stand taller and we see further. Right? We are superior. You all know we're the city on the hill, right? We have the right, we have the responsibility, and we have the capability to transform countries all around the world into liberal democracies, right? This is nationalism. So what I'm saying to you here, let me just give you another example. American exceptionalism. You surely all believe in American exceptionalism. And if any of you plan to run for political office in the United States, you better say you believe in American exceptionalism. Andrew Cuomo just got himself in trouble for denying that. And Barack Obama flirted with that argument. And he quickly backed off. Well, if you believe in American exceptionalism, you believe in American nationalism. Because exceptionalism is what nationalism is all about. Right? So what you have here is a country that is fueled by both nationalism and liberalism, right? So it is hardly surprising that this country is going to go on a rampage and try to remake the world. And then finally, and this is a very important part of my argument, I believe you can only pursue liberal hegemony in unipolarity. The reason is, if you're in bipolarity or multipolarity, you have other great powers to deal with. And you have to act according to the dictates of realism. Right? Bipolarity means two great powers, multipolarity, three or more. Unipolarity, there's only one great power. Well, if there's only one great power, you don't have to worry about great power politics. This is where the United States was at the end of the Cold War. We were Godzilla. We were incredibly powerful relative to everybody else in the system. Tremendous amounts of power. Charles Krauthammer called this the unipolar moment. So here we are, we're incredibly powerful, and we think that liberal democracy is the wave of the future. We think we have the wind at our back. And we think the idea of spreading liberal democracy, given how powerful we are, is going to be easy. And we don't have to worry about balance of power politics. 1991, the Soviet Union disappears. It was a weakling even before it disappeared. China hasn't risen yet. There's nobody else out there. We don't have to worry about the balance of power, so we are free to pursue liberal hegemony. If you're in a bipolar system or a multipolar system, I'm getting way ahead of myself now. Think rise of China, think resurrection of Russian power. Not much room for liberal hegemony. You're talking about balance of power politics. Pivot to Asia, ... You know the story. But here, if you have unipolarity and the sole pole, that's Uncle Sugar, the sole pole is profoundly liberal, right, and profoundly nationalistic, you're off to the races. And that's what happened starting in the early 1990s. Hang on just 1 second. I'll move it with this. Yeah, liberal hegemony's track record. Just want to talk a little bit about this. These are the failures of American foreign policy. Talk about the Bush Doctrine in the greater Middle East, Afghanistan. You think we're going to turn Afghanistan into a liberal democracy? Just a question when we turn it back over to the Taliban. Longest war in American history. Iraq, total disaster, led to the creation of ISIS. Hundreds of thousands of people died. Iran now has significant influence in Iraq. Syria, we played a key role in unsettling the regime in Syria. That's worked out really well. Libya, we played a key role in toppling Colonel Gaddafi from power. That's really worked out very well. We're deeply involved in the war in Yemen now, which is a human rights catastrophe. The Americans ought to be embarrassed for their disgraceful behavior, supporting this war, supporting the Saudis. You look at our track record in the greater Middle East, failure after failure. And Donald Trump, to his credit, pointed this out in the campaign. And the American people fully understand this. The elites in this country don't, because they're deeply invested in these wars. But dismal track record. The Ukraine crisis and U.S.-Russia relations, of course, inside the elite, we blame the Russians. The Americans never blame themselves for anything. But actually what happened here is that the United States decided, when the Cold War ended, that we would take NATO and we would take the EU and we would march them eastward, right up to the border of Russia. And what we would do is we would help solidify the democracies that had emerged in Eastern Europe after the Cold War. We would get the countries in Eastern Europe embedded in international institutions like NATO and the EU. We would get them hooked on capitalism, and we would make sure they were liberal democracies. By the way, those countries that weren't liberal democracies, we would foment revolutions. Remember the Orange Revolution in Ukraine? The Rose Revolution in Georgia? Right? It's all part of a piece. It's all part of this story. Right? Realists like me, George Kennan, we all said, are you crazy? You think you could take a military alliance that was a mortal enemy of the Soviet Union during the Cold War and march it right up to the Russians' border, and they're just going to sit there and take it? And of course, the Russians screamed bloody murder about NATO expansion from 1995 forward. We didn't listen, right? But it eventually blew up in our face. Georgia, 2008, Ukraine, 2014. We are principally responsible for creating the crisis that led to Russia recapturing Crimea, or capturing Crimea, depending on your view, and for the war in Ukraine today. The Russians have basically said, you're not going to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on our border. Not going to happen. We'll wreck it before we let that happen. And they said the same thing about Georgia. From an American point of view, this makes eminently good sense. You've all heard of the Monroe Doctrine, right? You know what the Monroe Doctrine says? No distant great power from Europe or East Asia is allowed to come into the Western Hemisphere with military force and form an alliance with any country in this region. That's the Monroe Doctrine. I'm old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. We went ballistic when we found out the Soviets had put missiles in Cuba. And then later they were talking about building a naval base at Cienfuegos. Who do these people think they are? Don't they understand that this is the Western Hemisphere? They are not allowed to move military forces into this region. We still have sanctions on Cuba. God knows how many years since 1959 this has been going on. Because the Cubans had the audacity to form a military alliance with a distant great power. Well, as my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And if we can have a Monroe Doctrine, are you shocked that they had a Monroe Doctrine, or they have a Monroe Doctrine? You're shocked that the Russians don't like the idea of us marching NATO right up to their border? You shouldn't be. You shouldn't be. Great powers, I can tell you from studying a lot of military history, are remarkably sensitive about their borders. And the idea that an enemy is going to creep right up to their borders, and they're just going to stand there and say, oh, that's okay. We live in a world of peace, love, and dope. That's not the way international politics works. That's realism 101, slamming liberal hegemony. It's also all about nationalism, right? Because the United States is interested in interfering in the politics of both Russia and China. And this brings us to engagement with China. Our goal from the beginning has been to turn China into a liberal democracy. That involves interfering with their politics. Do you think they were happy about that? No, they weren't. Let's go back to the goose and the gander. You've been watching all of these Americans screaming bloody murder about the fact the Russians are interfering in our election. Well, don't you think the Chinese and the Russians are going to scream bloody murder when we try and interfere in their politics? They are. Surprise of surprises. But of course, liberals, and here again I'm talking about Republicans and Democrats, view us as a benign hegemon. We're a benign hegemon. We only have good intentions, and we just want to make the world look like us. And of course, once that happens, we all live happily ever after. Didn't work out that way. Just look at that giant disaster zone called the Middle East. Look at the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who've died. We have a lot of blood on our hands. U.S.-Russian relations, we bear the principal responsibility for the deterioration of those relations. And with regard to engagement, it's been a failure. Principal architects like Kurt Campbell now admit that's true. We failed. The policy has been an abject failure. So the question is, why did it fail? I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but power of nationalism, right? I was one of the leading opponents, there weren't many, in the sort of foreign policy establishment. I was one of the leading opponents of the Iraq War. I think it was because I was in the American military from 1965 to 1975, which was coterminous with the Vietnam War. And when I heard that these people were thinking about invading Iraq, I said, have they lost their mind, right? There's no question the United States military is an incredibly formidable fighting force, and we can topple regimes almost anywhere in the world. Maybe China and Russia left out. We can go into Iran, go into Iraq, go into Syria. You can topple regimes. But the problem is, what do you do once you own the place, right? What do you do? You're greeted as a liberator the first day, week, maybe even the first month, right? All sorts of people were glad we got rid of Saddam Hussein. But then we got to stay to do social engineering. And this is a prescription for big trouble. Remember what I told you about sovereignty? Remember what I told you about self-determination? You think the Iraqis wanted us telling them what color toilet paper they could use? I don't think they liked it at all. And we had resistance, serious resistance. You want to wreck Russia? Tell them to invade Ukraine. That'll be pretty. Let them go into Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Let them reestablish the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe. You think that'll make them more powerful? They'll be up to their eyeballs in alligators. I remember in 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Virtually everybody in the national community, security community was aghast. Oh my God, the Soviets are on the march. This is the end of the world. I said, you got it all wrong. They just jumped into a giant tar pit. When you're involved in an arms race with a country like the Soviet Union, what you want them to do is go into Afghanistan. Just like you want us to go into Vietnam. You want to do that one again? Almost tore this country apart. Almost wrecked our military. Whew. I told the Chinese when I first started going there in the early 2000s, what you ought to tell the Americans is you're counting on them to win the war on terror. Tell them they got to stay in Afghanistan and Iraq until they win the war. They'll be there forever, grinding up their military, wrecking their economy. You know what the lesson here is? Stay out of those places unless you absolutely have to go in. But we had exactly the opposite worldview because we had a foreign policy that's based on liberalism. Right? We thought we had a right, a responsibility, and a capability to do all this social engineering. Power of nationalism, you never want to underestimate it. And you want to understand that as Americans, you are very nationalistic, and you ain't special. Everybody else on the planet is very nationalistic. And nationalism is all about self-determination and sovereignty. And if you don't like people interfering in your politics, don't be surprised that they don't like you interfering in their politics. Talk about the power of realism. Again, when you're dealing with China and you're dealing with Russia, you're dealing with very powerful countries, and you start moving military alliances, you start moving military forces up to their borders, you get in their face, you're asking for serious trouble. Right? Just talk to the Chinese sometime about how they think about those American naval and air forces right off their coast. It really bothers them. They don't like it at all. I don't blame them. Right? As an American, I'm glad we're there. I want to contain the Chinese. Let me be very clear about that. I'm a realist. I don't want to cut the Chinese any slack. But I understand why they get upset. But again, liberal hegemony doesn't buy that line of argument. Now, I want to talk about overselling individual rights and illiberal liberalism. Just very quickly on overselling individual rights. The fact is that we make a really big deal about the importance of rights here in the United States. But if you look around the world, most people don't really think that individual rights matter that much. In a thoroughly liberal country like the United States, you can sell that kind of argument up to a point, but it's very hard to do abroad, especially in countries where people prize security. If you go to Russia today and you talk to people about liberal democracy and rights, they will tell you, almost all of them, we tried that in the 1990s, and Russia was turned into the Wild West. We're much happier with Putin and the political system that we have. Soft authoritarianism. It's much more suited for us. And we don't care that much about rights. We have some rights, we understand their limits, but we don't want your political system. We've been there, we tried that, it didn't work. Right? So what I'm saying to you is in a lot of countries, When you invade them and you think you can do social engineering, all for the purpose of turning them into liberal democracies, what you discover in almost all those cases is that being turned into a liberal democracy where individual rights are prized is not that important. It's not to say it's unimportant, but people are just not craving for individual rights. And in many cases, they're just craving for stability. If you're an Iraqi and it's 2003 and Uncle Sugar pays you a visit, he topples the regime, right, and then chaos breaks out. Over the next couple of years, you're not going to be worried too much about creating a liberal democracy. You're not going to be worried too much about individual rights. You're just going to be worried about what you can do to stabilize the country so that you and your family don't get killed, right? So you just want to understand that we tend to oversell individual rights. And when you marry that with the power of nationalism and the power of realism, you get into real trouble. My final point has to do with illiberal liberalism. Remember what I told you about liberalism to begin with. I told you that liberalism was predicated on the assumption that you could not reach universal agreement on first principles. Remember I told you that. And therefore you develop sort of a live and let live political order. That's what liberalism is. It's a modus vivendi form of politics. You let people decide for themselves. If he wants to be a Protestant, I want to be a Catholic. He wants to be a Jew, I want to be a Muslim. You let people do what they want, okay? Because you can't reach universal agreement. If you think about it, liberal hegemony is based on intolerance. It says everybody has to be a liberal democracy. My view is if you have soft authoritarianism in Russia, so what? That's their choice. Why can't they have a soft authoritarian system? Why do we have to say everybody has to look like us? Isn't this antithetical to the basic liberal enterprise? I think the answer is yes. Case for restraint, very quickly. If I'm running foreign policy, and you can rest assured that will never happen, but if I was running American foreign policy from the early 90s forward, I would have pursued a policy of restraint. I would have abandoned liberal hegemony, which mainly means abandoning the policy of spreading democracy around the world. Okay, I think that was the key mistake that we made. Right? We thought that liberal democracy was going to take root everywhere. For those of you young people who haven't read Frank Fukuyama or Francis Fukuyama's famous article, The End of History, you really should read it. The two most important articles that were written when the Cold War ended were Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and Charles Krauthammer's The Unipolar Moment. And basically what Frank Fukuyama said is that we spent the first half of the 20th century defeating fascism. We spent the second half defeating communism. And now that we had won those two battles, all that was really left standing was liberal democracy. And the world was slowly but steadily going to evolve into a system of liberal democracies. And Frank says at the very end of the piece that the biggest problem that we're going to face in the future is probably boredom. Boredom. Why boredom? Because once you have a world that's populated by all liberal democracies, you get peace. And Krauthammer wrote this piece called The Unipolar Moment that he said this is a unique moment in world history, and the United States is by far the most powerful state on the planet. We have this tremendous military, and we ought to use it to reshape the world in our own interest. You marry Krauthammer's argument with Fukuyama's argument. Fukuyama says we've got the wind at our back. Krauthammer says we have this big stick that we can use to facilitate the process, and you're off to the races, right? And this, of course, is exactly what happens. But I would have abandoned that. And I would have concentrated instead on maintaining a favorable global balance of power, which mainly means containing the rise of China. Right? As you would expect from a realist like me, what I really care about is not what kind of political system a state has. I just care how much power it has. And my principal goal as an American is to make sure we are the most powerful state on the planet. And as many of you know, in my lexicon, that means to make sure we are a hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. We want to be a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere and make sure that there is no hegemon in Europe or in East Asia or in the Gulf. Right? So I believe in primacy. That's my definition of primacy, to be the most powerful state in the system. But I'm not interested, to go back to my first point, in spreading liberal democracy. Again, I think liberal democracy is a wonderful thing. If every state in the world was a liberal democracy, I think that would be good for the people who live in those countries. But my view is, because I believe in sovereignty, it's up to them to decide what they want. Final point I want to make to you here on this slide is liberalism abroad leads to illiberalism at home. This is what the founding fathers understood. If you're in a permanent state of war, right, it's going to have consequences for liberalism at home because you're going to create a national security state. And you're going to have a state that spies on people and does all sorts of other things. So I think from a point of view of civil liberties, this foreign policy is bankrupt. Final point, the end of liberal hegemony. You remember what John said to you very early in the talk? I said that you could only have liberal hegemony in unipolarity. Because in unipolarity, the sole pole, which is the United States, does not have to worry about great power politics, because by definition, you can't have great power politics when there's only one great power. Well, we are now transitioning out of unipolarity into multipolarity. This is very clearly reflected in a document on the country's national security strategy that the White House issued in December of 2017, and then the Pentagon in January of 2018 issued a similar document on our national security strategy. And both these documents make it clear that multipolarity is here, that unipolarity is over with, and great power politics is what we're going to be mainly concerned with in the future. And that has to do with, one, the rise of China, which I think for all of you young people in the audience will be the most important issue of your lifetime. And then the second issue is the resurrection of Russian power after Putin came to office in 2000. Russia is a declining great power. You don't want to overestimate Russian power, right? China is the real threat to the United States here. But nevertheless, the Russians are back, and the Russians have thousands of nuclear weapons, and they can cause us a lot of trouble, and we are at loggerheads with them over the Ukraine crisis. So we want to pay them serious attention. But what I'm saying to you here is that I think with the coming of multipolarity, liberal hegemony will go away. Now, if I'm wrong and we remain in a unipolar world because the Chinese rise doesn't continue and Russia begins to fall apart again, and we are once again the unipole, then we're back to arguing against liberal hegemony and making the case for restraint. But I don't think that people like me are going to have to make the case for restraint in the future, in large part because of the rise of China. I would say, and this is my concluding point, that I have very mixed emotions about that. On one hand, I welcome the rise of China and the resurrection of Russian power because it means that liberal hegemony is going away. But on the other hand, what it means is that the United States is now facing a potential peer competitor. And I think all things considered, I'd rather have liberal hegemony as a problem to deal with rather than have China and Russia as twin problems to deal with.
好啦，翻嚟啦嚇，咁啊中間咧佢講得有得快咗少少啊，咁啊如果快咗少少嗰啲咧，可能咧大家要重聽都未定。咁啊，但係咧成個對話裏邊咧，我最深刻講嗰個咧，就係嗰個叫自由主義霸權。即係話咧，一定強迫你個國家一定要變成好似我哋咁行呢個咩民主自由嘅制度，就唔俾人選擇。喂，我係俄羅斯，我係中意嗰個叫軟權威啊，輕微嘅權威，我係中意咁啊，我都試過咗你嗰種做法啦，我覺得唔適合我哋喎。嗱，佢都講到話試過㗎啦，已經都係覺得唔中意、唔適合，咁所以咧行翻我哋自己嗰個，但係美國唔俾。呢個咧就係自由主義霸權係咪？強迫人哋一定要用你嗰個，呢個係佢講到咧係最唔自由嘅一樣嘢嚟㗎。因為你強迫人哋跟足你一模一樣，呢個咧係我最深刻嘅。咁啊，當中當然裏邊咧有好多討論嘅空間㗎。咁啊，留翻俾大家咧一齊喺下邊咧研究啦嚇。因為條片咧太長，我就唔再多講啦。不過咧，我覺得咧真係好有用。如果你聽明咗之後咧，你就知道咧美國咧而家點解會失敗，因為咧。自由呢個自由霸權係咪？自由主義霸權只係喺咧單極世界裏邊嘅時候先可以行得通㗎。當而家咧有兩個崛起嘅中國同俄羅斯之後咧，美國咧就唔可以再咧攞住呢支歌仔嚟唱㗎啦。我自豪因我多角度思考，晏啲再見，拜拜。